Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on unpacking the National Longitudinal Land Use Survey, examining land use practices over 25 years. Over the next hour, we will introduce you to a new data source on land use, providing some history about it, sharing what's in the data set, and showing you some examples for how to use these data. This is a webinar about the data sets and what you can do with them. We're not presenting research from these data. So let's start with introductions. Rolf?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rolf Pendahl. I'm a professor and the head of the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I'm also a non-resident fellow at the Urban Institute.
And my name's Megan Gallagher. I'm a senior research associate in the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center at the Urban Institute.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lydia Lowe, and I'm a research analyst also in the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center at the Urban Institute.
Hi, everybody. My name is Christopher Davis, and I'm also a research analyst in the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center at the Urban Institute.
And for those of you who might not be familiar with the Urban Institute, we are a nonprofit research organization based in Washington, D.C. that has served as a leading voice on social and economic policy research for over 50 years. We'd like to take a few seconds to acknowledge the funder for this project, Fannie Mae. This project was funded by the Economic and Strategic Research Group at Fannie Mae. And we also want to acknowledge the survey respondents who took the time out of their busy schedules to participate in this survey. Before we get started, I want to share an overview of this webinar. First, we will provide some history on the NLLUS data. Then we will discuss how it was collected and what it covers. Then we'll talk about recommended uses, constraints, and recommendations. Uses, constraints, and limitations. And then finally, we'll describe some of the ways to access it. So let's start with the history and background. Rolf?
Thanks, Megan. So let me just walk you through here where it came from. NLLUS is a survey of local government land use and affordable housing practices and regulations in the most populous metropolitan statistical areas, now core-based statistical areas in the United States. The first survey went out in 1994 to the top 25 most populous metropolitan areas. It was first conceived as part of my dissertation on land use and racial segregation. The results from that survey became the foundation for two key articles that I wrote. The first one, The Chain of Exclusion, which is referenced there on the webinar screen, shows that exclusively low-density zoning, the communities that use exclusive low-density zoning tend to have exclusion of African Americans and Latinos over time. The other article, Do Land Use Controls Cause Sprawl, connects low-density zoning to lower urban density, which is one of the main indicators of sprawl. And in 2003, I received support from the Brookings Institution to administer the survey again on an expanded universe of the most populous metropolitan areas. That year, I surveyed the top 50 metro areas, doubling what I'd done previously in 1994. Building on those two surveys, I worked with the co-authors listed on this slide to publish a 2006 publication with Brookings, which found that local land use regulations varied widely across the United States, and that the different land use practice families produce a variety of effects on metropolitan growth and density. Then in 2018, I worked with a different set of co-authors on a new article published in Housing Policy Debate about how much and why regulations changed between 1994 and 2003. It found that regulations are in flux to an underappreciated degree within jurisdictions, and it underscored that the use of certain regulatory tools is highly regional. Several other researchers have also used the 1994 and 2003 data for additional research, most notably Jonathan Rothwell and Doug Massey, who confirmed and strengthened the link from low-density zoning to racial exclusion and segregation that I first showed in my earlier article, The Chain of Exclusion. I initiated this most recent survey while I was at the Urban Institute out of conversations with Fannie Mae. I worked closely with Megan Gallagher, Lydia Lowe, Ananya Hariharan, and Chris Davis to administer it and link it with well-documented and clean versions of the 1994 and 2003 data to produce this full public longitudinal data set. Now I'm going to turn the mic over to Lydia Lowe, who will discuss the survey.
Hey everyone. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the survey, and I'll go fairly fast, but everything that I'm sharing today can be found in the user guide. So what's in the survey? This is a data set about residential land use planning and zoning. These are the rules and regulations that affect how and where things are built. As we mentioned earlier, data come from 1994, 2003, and 2019 surveys. Each survey had a small set of questions that are unique to that year, but all three have a set of core common questions that remained the same from year to year. These core questions covered general land use planning practices, maximum dwelling units per acre, permissions for mid-density multifamily development, growth limits, like urban boundaries, population growth rates, or building permit restrictions and moratoria, and then infrastructure-related regulations like impact fees and adequate public facilities ordinances. And finally, we also have information on inclusionary zoning requirements and other affordable housing incentives and supports, like bonus density, streamlined permitting, affordable housing trust funds, and more. So these questions that are in the survey cover what a jurisdiction zoning ordinance allows in general. And those are the rules. They're not what neighborhoods jurisdictions have zoned as what category. Just want to be very clear about what's in the survey and what it's not. So the following, we're going to go into who we surveyed and how we surveyed them. The units of analysis for this survey is the local government or the jurisdiction. The major units are counties, which usually govern unincorporated land, like DeKalb County in Metro Atlanta. Then there are townships that are halfway between municipalities and counties, like Linwood Township in Minneapolis-St. Paul Metro. They are smaller than counties, and they also govern unincorporated land, but they only exist and have land use planning authority in some states. In New York, these jurisdiction types are called towns, and then in New England, they're called municipalities. And then finally, the final unit of analysis that we have is an incorporated place, like the city of Pickering in Metro Columbus. And an incorporated place is a census term for what we commonly call cities, villages, or towns. Incorporation requirements and powers for these places vary greatly from state to state. It's important to note that we surveyed these local jurisdictions because land use and zoning are not affected by federal laws. The nature of these local laws is grouped mostly at the state level, but they are determined exclusively by local governments, and that's part of the design of American federalism. So which levels of government we included were chosen based on which ones have land use planning authority in each state. There's a lot of text on this slide, and it's a complicated map. I'm simply showing it to communicate that which states have what levels of government and the powers that those levels of government have to zone is not standard across the United States. What you need to know most is that we carefully sifted through these jurisdictions to figure out which ones have zoning authority and which ones were appropriate to include in the survey. If you're interested in learning what kinds of jurisdictions can zone in what states, you can find this map in our brief and a more in-depth discussion in the data user guide. Once we had zoning authority clarified, we needed to choose which of those zoning authorized jurisdictions we'd survey. First criteria we used was whether the jurisdictions fell within the U.S.'s most populous core-based statistical areas. And a core-based statistical area is another census term that means areas surrounding a metropolitan core that are economically tied to that central city through commuting. In 1994, Rolf surveyed the 25 most populous CBSAs as defined by the 1990 census. Then, in 2003, he increased the survey size to include the top 50 most populous CBSAs as defined by the 2000 census. And then, in 2019, we kept Rolf's 2003 definition and surveyed again the top 50 CBSAs as defined this time by the 2011 through 2015 American Community Survey, or the ACS. With our CBSAs picked out and a list of zoning authorized jurisdictions in hand, we selected our sample. We began by including all counties in the 2019 CBSAs, and then any counties who responded in the 2003 survey. Within the 2019 counties, we then also included all jurisdictions who had populations greater than 10,000. For jurisdictions with populations less than 10,000 people, we included them only under certain conditions. In 2019, we sampled 50 jurisdictions with populations less than 10,000 in 3 CBSAs, Minneapolis, Cincinnati, and Chicago. In 2003, more of these smaller jurisdictions had been included. We included those small population jurisdictions who responded in 2003 into our 2019 survey. Since jurisdictions are run by people, we had to figure out who to ask to fill out the survey. So we prioritized folks in the planning and community development departments, and then went down the line of who would have the most knowledge of and daily exposure to zoning and land use regulations in that jurisdiction. The technology and timeframes for the survey changed over the years as technology changed. However, in 2019, we conducted the survey on a digital platform and thus needed to use email addresses to distribute it. We used an algorithm to scrape the internet for names and email addresses for the person who would know best about the planning practices in each jurisdiction, and then we hand confirmed each of those names and addresses. We piloted and refined our instrument and process in October of 2018, and then emailed the survey out to the full group in January of 2019. Respondents had 5 weeks to complete the survey and used Qualtrics as a survey platform to fill it out. Next, we're going to share some information with you about the number of respondents and response rates. In 1994, Rolf surveyed 1,510 jurisdictions, and 1,168 jurisdictions responded, yielding a whopping 77% response rate. In 2003, Rolf surveyed 3,177 jurisdictions, and 1,845 of those responded for a 58% response rate. And most recently, in 2019, we surveyed 3,100 jurisdictions and received 1,703 responses for a 55% response rate. I do want to note 2 things about this most recent response rate. The first is that survey response rates have been trending downwards with the rise of digital communication. And this response rate is exceptional given that the average digital response rate is 30%. Second, I wanted to note that even with a 55% response rate, the jurisdictions who responded are still home to 45% of the total U.S. population. So we have some pretty good coverage here. In terms of non-response analysis, we checked to see whether jurisdictions in 2019 who responded differed significantly from those who didn't respond on a number of characteristics. We looked at their population, their land area, their region, and their jurisdiction type. We found that non-respondents were not different in terms of their population size or land area. However, non-respondents were more likely to be in Northeast jurisdictions and were more likely to be boroughs or villages. And boroughs are also more likely to be in the Northeast. So by year, turning towards how 1994, 2003, and the 2019 surveys can all be linked together over the years, this table lays out where jurisdictions fall in terms of which survey years they responded. You have to do a little bit of math with this, but you can figure out how between the years, how many repeat respondents or panel respondents you have. If you want to analyze the changes across all iterations, you have 446 respondents who answered the survey in all 3 years. And if you want to analyze the changes over time between 2003 and 2019, you have 1,034 repeat respondents to work with. That's 588 plus the 446 there. And then if you wanted to look at the changes between 1994 and 2019, you'd have 654 jurisdictions to work with. That's 208 plus 446. So now for the actual meat of the responses that these jurisdictions gave, we have two types of data sets that you can use for this analysis. We have variables that are in the 1994, 2003, and 2019 individual year data files. These include geographic identifiers like FIPS codes, jurisdiction names, counties, states, regions, and land areas for the jurisdictions, and then the original survey variables that contain respondents' answers to survey questions. We also have longitudinal data sets where we linked the 1994, 2003, and 2019 jurisdictions' FIPS codes and names together to connect a jurisdiction's responses to previous responses from earlier surveys. We've published the longitudinal data in two ways. There's a wide format, which has a record for each unique jurisdiction, and then there's a long format, which has a record for each year for each jurisdiction. The longitudinal data sets contain the same original survey variables that the single year data sets contain. So they also have the geographic identifiers and the original survey variables. But they also have two additional sets of variables. They have comparable variables, which we created. So to compare the questions and the data across years, we created a set of standardized variables that we list in the data user guide. And these variables each have a grade that corresponds to how much manipulation was necessary before the data could be compared. An A grade means that, that they were directly comparable in their original format. A B grade means some small manipulation was required or that the context of the questions were just slightly different. And then a C grade meant that the wording or the response options were different enough that these variables should only be used for qualitative descriptions and not quantitative analysis. In those C grade contexts, it might be that the topic was similar, like they both asked about mobile homes, but the way that they asked about the question, that we asked about the question, or the answer types were different enough that you can look at them, but you really shouldn't use them, as I said, for quantitative analysis. There are about 45 of these standardized comparable variables in the longitudinal data set. And you can look to the user guide for descriptions of which original source variables or original survey variables were used to create the comparable variables. We also added census variables, which Chris, our census guru here, is going to explain.
Thank you, Lydia. I'm going to walk you through how the NLLUS fits with census data, what data we've attached, and some cautions and caveats about using the data. We paired the 1994 NLLUS data with census data from the 1990 decennial census. 2003 survey data was paired with the 2000 decennial census, and 2019 survey data was paired with the 2013-2017 ACS, which is the most recent 5-year data available at this time. The variables we attached include population-related variables, such as total population, racial demographic data, income, and poverty. And as the survey contained a number of questions related to the zoning of housing units, we also included a number of housing-related census variables, including housing units, that's total housing units, multifamily housing units, owner and renter-occupied units, and vacancies. These are all reflected in terms of the number of housing units that exist. And then we also included some variables with median and aggregate housing value and median contract and gross rent. And then finally, we also included the jurisdiction's land area to be able to calculate changes in area over time and also measure densities. If you want to attach other census variables, you can use the FIPS codes and the summary levels to identify the census data you want to match to. There are 3 jurisdiction geographies available in the dataset: county, county subdivision, and place level. Each geography has a different summary level, such as 050 for the county, and a different length to the corresponding census FIPS codes to merge on, such as the 5-digit code you see for Bibb County. For county subdivision, you would use the 10-digit FIPS code, which includes the 5-digit state county code and the 5-digit county subdivision code. And for the place level, you would use a 7-digit FIPS code, which includes a 2-digit state code and a 5-digit place code. We want to raise a quick word of caution about using the census data as it stands. Some geographies, mostly counties and county subdivisions, have governments that do not have zoning authority over the full space of the geography. The census records are inclusive of the population across the full geography, so these records don't necessarily reflect the true number of people living on land that the government entity in the geography zones. For example, you can see in the image on the slide that Fairfax County in Virginia only governs land for the blue shaded portions, and the cutout towns govern their own land. However, the census variables for Fairfax County include all the populations of those towns in them. The towns have jurisdictions over their respective areas in this case, not the county. So you may want to adjust the census information to account for this fact when looking at particular geographies as zoning entities. However, since the residents of the full geographical areas often vote for elected officials in the larger areas, you may want to consider how residents of incorporated areas influence land use policy in townships and counties. Some other issues to note: there are and will be missing census records in the longitudinal data set. Some jurisdictions have incorporated over the course of the past 25 years and won't have existed in previous censuses, and other jurisdictions have dissolved. There are a few other cases where FIPS codes changed because names changed or jurisdictions merged. Also, one last note of caution: the census numbers provided haven't been adjusted in any way to account for boundary changes or for inflation. Next, we will share recommended uses for the data as well as limitations and constraints. Lydia?
Great. So we're going to start this section by describing aspects of the NLLUS that users should be aware of. Since it's a new data set, we want to be super clear about its strengths and weaknesses. So let's start with the strengths. These data are great for telling us about the general allowances of zoning ordinances and legal codes in jurisdictions with more than 10,000 people in large CBSAs. And as I noted before, that's over 45% of the U.S. population. The constraints, though, it's important for you to know that these data don't represent every place in the country equally well. This comes partly from the survey design. Earlier in the presentation, we explained how jurisdictions were selected and saw maps on which CBSAs are represented in the sample design. So there were entire metro areas that we did not survey, and then smaller population jurisdictions within the most populous metro areas also were not surveyed. Then we also learned that about half of the jurisdictions that were selected and surveyed did not respond to the survey. And some jurisdictions were more likely to participate than others. So what does this mean for you as a user? In some cases, you might need to develop weights so that the jurisdictions in the survey represent the types of places that you're interested in. Use cases, even with these limitations, if you want to use them for all of the strengths that they do have, they can be used in multiple ways. You can use the data to look up zoning processes in a single jurisdiction. You can use them to look at trends across jurisdictions or across time. And you can also use it to look at how multiple factors interact with each other, like geography, different practices, and time trends. So these are some of the ways that we've thought about using the data. While we go over these, please send us some comments in the chat box about how you think you might use the data. So we've thought about using the data to explore whether zoning varies across different jurisdiction types, or whether zoning changes are associated with other changes like demographic, income, or neighboring jurisdiction zoning changes. Then we've also thought about whether or not we could explore the relationship between zoning policies and housing production, and explore the relationship between how unified or how granular zoning authority is in a region and the provision of land-based goods like green space, density, and affordable housing. We've also thought about exploring how local land use regulations are used to finance infrastructure and public goods and whether those change over time. We encourage you to think of multiple other questions and are excited to see what comes of your use of the data. Next, I'm going to go and turn this over to Rolf, and he's going to discuss how he is currently using the data.
Actually, I'm going to back up a little bit and talk a bit about how I use the data for the previous articles that I mentioned earlier. In those 3 articles, I took 3 different approaches. In chain of exclusion, I assumed that a jurisdiction's regulations in 1994 probably correlated with its regulatory environment in 1980 and 90. I tested how the housing stock, the housing tenure, the affordability of rental housing, and the racial composition of jurisdictions changed from 1980 to 1990 based on whether they had each of 6 main regulations. The Rothwell and Massey article I mentioned earlier used better statistical methods in the late 2000s, I think about 2008, 2009. They also used both the 1994 and the 2000 surveys together to underscore my earlier finding about the connections between low density only zoning and racial exclusion. For the article on do land use controls cause sprawl, I estimated the percent of each county's land area covered by the same regulations that I examined in chain of exclusion, and I showed the correlation between regulations and changes in density from 1982 to 1997. Again, there I showed the connection that that low density only zoning works, in a sense that it actually causes sprawl. And then in the recent publication with Jake Wegman, Jonathan Martin, and Dewey Wei, we found a lot of flux from 1993 to 2003 among the repeat respondents to the surveys on 5 or 6 different regulations. And we looked to explain the patterns of adoption, that is, who adopted them, who retained them, and who abandoned them over time. There's an ongoing project now that I'm working on with colleagues at the Urban Institute in which we're exploring what it takes to change the rules. As some of the listeners might know, a few cities like Minneapolis and states like Oregon have recently changed their zoning laws to foster higher density development, especially in single family neighborhoods. This ongoing process of research that we're involved in will be using the results from NLLUS to identify places that reduced restrictiveness in similar ways. We'll be exploring the local market and political dynamics that led to the reforms. That is, what does it take to pass these kinds of regulatory changes? Then we'll learn more about how communities have implemented the newly changed rules, because if you change your rules and then the planners don't change their practices, then it might not make that big a difference. And then finally investigate quantitatively whether the reforms that we observed using NLLUS affected housing supply and housing prices. So we've got a lot in mind for this project, and I'm sure that some of those of you who are listening may have similar things in mind. If so, we're definitely interested in hearing your use cases as we go forward and as you use the data.
That's great, Rolf. Thanks so much for giving us that background and those ideas. I'm going to walk us through now how you can explore everything that's associated with the NLLUS data. So I'm going to use these 3 links here. Aha, I have a cursor now. Great. I'm going to use these 3 links to walk you through some of the products that we have created and how to access them. So I'm going to start actually with the project page. We've created a project page where anyone can interact with the data from the surveys. You can explore the data from different years over time. You can explore them, you can see here using different years, or you can choose to explore them over time. I am going to choose to keep it on 2019. And then you can also explore different sets of questions on different topics. I'm going to pick fees and facility requirements here. And then you can also choose how it is that you want to group respondent jurisdictions. We have region, you have the jurisdiction type, and then you also have the population size. And then we wanted to make sure that people were also able to see the magnitude of the responses in addition to the proportion of responses, and you can do that by toggling this here. So for example, looking at impact fees here, or the fees that developers pay to cover public services and infrastructure, you can see that jurisdictions in the West are much more likely to have impact fees, and this remains obvious even if we switch to the magnitudes. There's just an overwhelming percentage and number of them that are using impact fees. And then if we change to look over time, changing that here, you can see that it's not so much that jurisdictions in the West are starting to implement or charge impact fees. It's more that they've been charging impact fees for a really long time and they're just keeping at it. So this page overall is a great place to start thinking about research questions, like why do we see these kinds of jurisdictions using that kind of land use regulation? At the bottom of the page, you'll find a set of links, and these are all resources that are associated with this data set and with the project overall. We have our brief, we have the full data set, the link to where you can download the data, and all the other materials on zoning linked here. Any future analyses of the data that we produce will be posted here, so please stay tuned. And I'm going to quickly show you our brief that we have. This just provides you a little bit of information on the motivation underlying the survey, as well as some of the literature that it connects to, and some details on the data as well as possible uses. And then finally, if we go here, let's go back to our project page. You can also link to the full data set, which is at datacatalog.urban.org, and you can search for the data set by typing in NLLUS, and it should pop up. This data page has a description of what's in each data set, links to download the data sets, all of those are here, and then also more information about the metadata on the file, who to contact, what the specs are, and all the supporting documents. Then we've also provided sets of code books that list the variables, the labels, and the response categories, so you're able to interpret what's in the data sets themselves. We also have a user guide, which is the resource on everything. It explains everything that we've presented on this webinar, but it's in much greater detail, and if you have questions, I would point you to that first. Then we also have the original survey questionnaires, so you can check to see what the wording was behind each question that's in the data sets themselves. And then we also have a crosswalk that relates counties to the metro areas that we created that don't change over time. And then finally, we have a log of all of the changes and updates that we've made to this page and to the data over time, as we're improving them as we find small things here and there that make it easier to use. All right, and then at the bottom of this page, you're going to find a recommended citation. This data is free to use as long as you cite it properly. So whatever format of citation you're using, you can pretty much find all of the information that you would need in order to cite this data set well, right here. And I'm going to pull up quickly one of the data files so you can see what it looks like. Right now, we're looking at Hamburg, Michigan. And you can see that there are three. This is the long version of the longitudinal NLLUS data set that has the census data attached to it. You can see that there are 3 records in this longitudinal file, and that's unique to the long form of the data set. But there are 3 records for each jurisdiction, and those correspond to the year of the survey. And you can see over here in these columns, the REST 1994, REST 2003, and REST 2019. Those columns all indicate what year, whether a respondent or a jurisdiction responded in that year. You can see here that Hamburg responded in all 3 years. And so we're going to scroll over to the right, and here we can start to see these are the comparable variables where we can track how this jurisdiction's responses changed over time. So things like max density, whether or not they used a moratorium, whether they had impact fees or not. And then we can keep scrolling to the right, and you'll suddenly see that the first two lines of data are blank, and that's because we've gotten into the variables that are unique to 2019 only. If we keep going to the right, that's going to shift over. Now we're in the variables that are unique to 2003 only. And then finally, those from 1994 only. At the far end of this data set, you'll find our census variables, so you can see how the characteristics from the census changed over time. All right, so that's all we have to show at this point, and I'd love to turn it over to Megan for some Q&A.
Absolutely. So all of you who are attendees to this webinar, if you can please type in any questions into the chat box, and we will do our best to answer them on the spot. We have received a couple of questions, and so the first question that we received is, can these data be used to understand how zoning has changed over time relating to manufactured homes? And the answer is yes and no. We did have a question on mobile homes in 2003, but the 2019 survey asks about mobile homes as well as other kinds of low-cost standalone homes like tiny homes and recreational vehicles. So to answer your question, you can learn about the permission of mobile homes over time, but most of the data on manufactured homes are new in 2019. I see another question. If our jurisdiction is not included in the data set, do you have any recommendations on how we can use the structure of this data set to investigate our own municipalities? Yes, of course. You can look at our survey instrument, the 2019 survey, and you can actually ask your jurisdiction these questions, and so that you have comparable data for your jurisdiction. Do we have any other questions? We had some questions come in before the webinar. So one question is, where can I get access to these data? And as Lydia pointed out, you can get access to these data through the Urban Institute Data Catalog, and that is at datacatalog.urban.org. Let's see, other questions. I see a question here. How would you use the data to assess shifts from only single-family R1 zoning to something more permissive, which seems one of the biggest changes to enable more affordable housing?
That is a great question. So in all of the surveys, we asked a question of the jurisdiction that said, what is the maximum allowed density in your zoning ordinance? And so while the survey doesn't ask about the extent of those R1 jurisdictions to multifamily or higher density zoning categories, it does ask about shifts and show shifts in the maximum density that a jurisdiction would allow. In 2019, we did also include a series of questions at the end of the survey that asked respondents to essentially retrospectively tell us how they think that the extent of single-family zoned neighborhoods and multifamily zoned neighborhoods have changed, as well as the extent of undeveloped single-family land and undeveloped multifamily land. Rolf, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, there's also one other question that was asked in both 2003 and 2019 that asked the respondents to tell us whether a prototypical apartment project, 40 dwelling units, 2 to 3 stories on a 5-acre site anywhere in their jurisdiction, is there any way within your current zoning ordinance that this kind of project could be built? And there were 3 responses in both 2003 and 2019. One of them was simply no, that our zoning wouldn't allow that at all. The second one is yes, but you'd need a special permit or other kind of process to go through that, and then and then also yes by right. So that, I think, is perhaps one of the more direct questions about whether they allow apartments or not, which does sort of map onto, to a certain extent, but not entirely, the questions about zoning. But those 2 questions together, I think, will be really useful for looking over time at the jurisdictions that have relaxed the most, and also those that have gotten more restrictive, which there are some.
Thank you.
Just putting this out there as well, you can explore those questions on the project page if you want to, by going to the zoned density category, and you can explore here the maximum density of units per acre and that question that Rolf was just introducing, and you can see respondents, the responses to those questions change over time, and you can also fiddle with them by jurisdiction type and population.
So we have another question here. Which small population jurisdictions were included in 2003? And the answer to that is that in 2003, Rolf identified a random sample of 50 small population jurisdictions in each CVSA where the total land area of the large populations covered less than 60% of the total land area.
So generally speaking, that means that in metro areas where counties don't have a role in land use planning or zoning, that often in those metro areas, I was sampling in those in the smaller jurisdictions as well. Again in 2003, there are a few states like Ohio is especially complicated, in which sometimes the township zone, sometimes they don't, sometimes the county zone, sometimes they don't. If the township and the county both do, the township zoning supersedes the county zoning. So this is relevant because it's complicated to figure out exactly which of these should be included and which not. So ultimately, we made the decision in 2019 to assume that if a county did have the potential to zone, that we wouldn't do any additional surveying of the small units beyond the jurisdictions that actually responded in 2003, whereas in some of the other ones we did, the ones where the counties don't have a role, we did go ahead and survey the smaller jurisdictions there.
All right. I wanted to make one clarification that the slide and what we said didn't match exactly. So in 2019, we defined the top CVSAs using the 2011 to 2015 ACS. And when we added the census data, we added the census data using the 2013-2017 ACS data. I just wanted to clarify that. So I'll wait another minute here to field any additional questions. we see a partial question. Okay. Well, this is a really good question. The question is, do we have any suggestions on policy responses for affordable housing that might be explored? Rolf, do you want to?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the areas where the questions evolved over time the most. In each of the 3 years, there are responses or questions and responses about local programs to make affordable housing happen. Some of them are regulatory programs like density bonuses and inclusionary zoning, which is a mandate for the provision of affordable housing to private sector builders. And some of them are more like relaxing the fees and reducing the time requirements. So those questions changed over time. And so that's one thing that you can explore the way we did this. The second set of questions is about whether the local government spent its own money or pursued other kinds of policies to make affordable housing work. So the advantage of the longitudinal set is that there is information all 3 years about these kinds of questions, but you'll have to do some of your own interpretation and reading to figure out to figure out what these questions mean, and to make sure that you're actually interpreting the data and its ability to answer those kinds of questions appropriately.
Thank you. We do have a question about downloading the longitudinal data codebook. And Lydia, can you help with that?
Yeah. Right now, we just updated the most recent data sets and the data dictionaries or the code books. And it seems like in our most recent update that the code book for the longitudinal file didn't upload properly. So you're not crazy. And we're going to upload a new version of that as soon as this webinar is over.
Thank you for that question. We want to make sure this is as accessible as it can be. Well, thank you everybody for joining this webinar. We look forward to hearing about research and use of these data moving forward. Please keep us in the loop on your work with it. We do have an email address that is connected to the National Longitudinal Land Use Survey. It's NLLUS@urban.org. And we will also follow up with attendees to provide a link to this webinar recording and the other resources that we discussed today. So thank you very much, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.